Our afternoon panel includes Carissa Caban-Aleman, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. Carissa, do you want to correct me on that?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, Carissa.
Carissa. And the last name?
Hi, Carissa.
Caban-Aleman.
Caban-Aleman. Thank you. Carissa is a member of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance that Dave was mentioning, works in Florida where she's assistant professor in psychiatry and behavioral health department at Florida International University. Also going to be with us is Cohen, a colleague and friend of ours here in Pittsburgh, a child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Southwood Hospital, and an associate who's been active on a variety of social and political issues over the years. She's contributed a lot to my experience as an activist wannabe. Matt Hurford is with us, I believe. I didn't see his name, but I think Matt's here.
Yep, I'm here.
There you are. And Matt is a psychiatrist who we know through the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council, serving now as president and CEO of the Community Care Behavioral Health Organization. And we have also Walter Lewis, who's the president and CEO of Home and Children's Village, which you might have heard mentioned earlier or seen mentioned earlier when we were here with Fred Brown, who had been who had preceded Walter as president and CEO of Home and Children's Village. So we're glad to have all of you here. Dave Pollack is going to be able to be around and may want to participate in some of the discussion after we hear from other folks. And as I mentioned earlier, Mary Beth Mannarino is going to be joining this panel as well, having been agreeable to a switch to accommodate Kara Smith, who was with us in the morning. We'll do this with me as the person with the virtual laser here. I'll invite you roughly in that order to take a few minutes to offer comments as you think best. And then as we're doing that, keep track of questions that come to me, to Wes, or to any of you. We'll, for the moment, except for those two nods to Loren and Dave, work through the chat, but time may permit for all of us to be unmuted during that hour. In any case, we'll have a chance to be talking together as a small group when we take a break after this panel discussion. Carissa, you're on?
Yes,
Glad
can
to
you?
have you with us. Appreciate your being available for this afternoon.
Sure. So I start?
Yes, please.
Perfect. So hi, good afternoon, everyone. I think you can have access to my bio. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about who I am, but basically I'm working in Miami. My training is as a community psychiatrist. I've been involved in the AACP since before I was a psychiatrist. I think I started to get to know about the AACP since I was a medical student because I wanted to do psychiatry only. So it's already been a few years. And I am from Puerto Rico, which has a lot to do with my involvement in climate change because Puerto Rico is a country that has been very impacted by climate change already. I'm going to project just a few slides to just frame the 4 answers that we are talking about today. I think it's coming up in a second. Okay, you should be able to see that. And basically, in terms of, okay, here we go. In terms of my emotional reaction to climate change, it tends to be guilt. I do feel sometimes survivor guilt based on the work that I've done supporting underserved populations in rural municipalities in Puerto Rico that have already been impacted chronically by so many social determinants of mental health beyond the big hurricane that a lot of you probably have heard of that hit Puerto Rico in 2017, Hurricane Maria. So it tends to be feeling guilt and feeling overwhelmed when I'm trying to maneuver different roles within our profession, and then sometimes on the side wanting to do a little bit to help with efforts of disaster recovery and also with climate change education. So I am trying to convert that into acceptance and not complacency, but acceptance in the sense of just accepting the reality that we have and trying to put my grain of sand to help and not feel so overwhelmed and just accept reality as it is and try to change what I can. And I think that I would like to use my personal experience to just motivate you to consider first a personal paradigm shift, because I see this in all of us, pretty much all of us that are trying to do this work from different sectors, that we're trying to do and do and do, because of course there is so much to do to address climate change. But that is actually part of, I think, the problem at a societal and global level that has led us to climate change, that we have been pretty much taught to think that we need to do things in life to be happy and to possess things to be happy. And so for mindfulness and meditation, I practice particularly Raj Yoga meditation. I've started to realize that if I can live from a perspective of just being, and then as a being doing, then that leads me to consume less, to feel less overwhelmed about the problems that I'm working with, and to be able to counteract climate change first from my own actions, because that paradigm leads us to consume, right? And to extract from nature, not only from non-human living beings, but also from human living beings that have been oppressed systemically for our colonial history for decades. So I think that we really need to learn from indigenous principles and really protect the knowledge and the existence of the indigenous populations that are still alive. So I wanted to really start with that. In terms of the strengths and resources that I use, it's basically, I think the main thing is collaboration and connecting, trying to connect people from different sectors. I have been very privileged to be able to do some of that work with an organization that I helped found with other Puerto Rican psychiatrists that's called Create with Health or Crear con Salud, which basically our initial intention was to promote mental health and decrease the stigma in Puerto Rico that culturally tends to persist about seeking psychiatric services and so forth. But we've turned ourselves into sort of like another nonprofit that is helping with disaster response. So partnerships, collaborations, and connecting and uniting, I think it's the main resource that I really find valuable in utilizing. Having said that, at the individual level, we really have to move beyond just the focus of therapy and psychiatric medications, right? We've talked about that today. You heard David mention all of the social determinants and Gary this morning and the other panelists. So I just wanted to point out this paper because I think it was really helpful for me to think about climate mental health risks and how to really visualize the underlying causes of the invisibilities that, for example, most Puerto Ricans have been living as an existing colony for more than 100 years, that increase their vulnerability to all of the impacts of climate change that they're already facing. And so looking at the strategies on the bottom in blue, I think that we might want to consider moving towards helping with these strategies directly, which is basically what Gary said this morning, right? I don't think that I'm going to feel comfortable just sticking to conventional medicine and psychiatry and just prescribing medications and doing a little bit of therapy. I think that we really need to consider the option of joining empowerment efforts. So that's what I've been trying to do. I know I think I have 6 to 8 minutes, so I'm keeping track of time. I've been doing 6 minutes. Yes. So basically, in terms of what do I care about in regards to climate change, I think the main concern for me is justice. And so I've tried to join some community empowerment efforts to try to address that I'm not going to have time to go over today. I wanted to emphasize a little bit of what Ken said in terms of moving beyond and working on solidarity. In my personal experience with working with different groups in Puerto Rico, I've seen a huge and tremendous impact of participatory community agroecology projects in terms of empowering systemically oppressed populations that are facing climate change in a very obvious level, and sustaining alliances with the leaders that are running that movement and other movements. I work with an organization called Vamos in Puerto Rico that is basically working for positive change in Puerto Rico and against colonization. And sustaining their work is really something that I think is really helpful. And so I want you to consider the concept of agroecology, because it's something that I think has a great healing potential in terms of helping people recover from complex and chronic trauma. And it also directly impacts climate change in terms of a solution to protect soil microorganisms. I don't have time for more, but maybe in the discussion we can talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Rich, very efficient use of 6 to 8 minutes. I'm working through the display I have here, and that takes me next to Claire Cohen.
Okay,
Claire,
so
good to have you.
yes. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a very exciting conference so far. A lot of what I was going to say in my talk has been said, but I'm going to concentrate on my answer to the 4 questions and 3 takeaway points. I didn't know if I could do PowerPoint and talking in 6 to 8 minutes, so I'm really impressed there. All right, so just to reiterate, I've been a psychiatrist and a community activist in Pittsburgh for 40 years. I can't believe it, but 40 years. I've been engaged in a number of struggles as well as practice in a variety of settings. So first, the questions. Number 1, my emotional response to climate change is alarm for my descendants and all of their friends and peers. Second, anger at how our political leaders have let us down by representing the interests of big money and corporation rather than focusing on the public good. 3, determination to do something about it. That's my well-being thing, determination to act. And 4, hope that organizing with like-minded activists will enable us to mitigate, not just adapt to climate change. My resources, my personal resources, are being a well-known community activist with many connections in the activist community. Hello, Wanda. My professional resources include a willingness to educate myself by reading relevant materials, including, believe it or not, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Reports. They're difficult. I would encourage you to try to read them, and also attending relevant CME report events. The third question, to me, the most important problem in climate change is how to educate and mobilize people from all walks of life to empower them to put pressure, mass pressure on our political leaders to do what needs to be done to address this issue in a just, timely, and adequate fashion. And finally, the group that I'm working with is a group called Pittsburgh Green New Deal. It just came together this year, and our goal is to educate the public and then try to mobilize people to put pressure on their political leaders. And to that event, we've been giving talks to churches, community groups, unions, colleges. I most recently just gave a talk at LaRoche College to the student union there on the health and mental health aspects of climate change. I'm hoping to inspire you, some of you, to sign. I put this link in the chat, but I must have messed it up. I'm hoping Tech will put another link in, because I'm hoping some of you will be inspired to join us in doing that education. That's what we're focusing on right now. The 3 key takeaway points that I want to make are: 1, that we as mental health experts need to focus not just on mental illness, but mental well-being. And this has already been said, so I'm not going to say a lot about it, but the key things are the impact of climate change on social determinants of health and adverse childhood experiences. Both of these are skyrocketing and will continue to do so. We have loss of jobs, loss of housing, loss of wealth, separation and loss issues, loss of caretakers. And as these things happen, we're going to see a decrease in well-being as well as an increase in mental disorders. I was going to talk in detail about the Bath University study, but Dr. Mannarino did. So I just want to emphasize two things about this study that I like. One is that it's not just looking at Europeans. 4 of the 6 countries they looked at were from the developing world: Nigeria, Brazil, Philippines, and I forgot the 4th one, India. So it's a pretty representative cross example. And she made the point of the distress that young people are feeling. The conclusion of the study is that governments have to respond. They have to respond in a real way. And we need to push our governments to do that. The second key point I wanted to take away, even though everybody's affected by this, it's disproportionately affecting people in marginalized groups: indigenous peoples, Black and brown peoples, poor peoples, immigrants, seniors, children, differently abled people, and homeless people. I wanted to give a couple of what I think are poignant examples before I end with what I think we should do. So one of the examples is the Yupik people. They're indigenous Alaskans who live along islands along the Alaskan coast. With the sea level rise, whole villages, not just homes, are being washed and wiped away. Also, with the melting of the permafrost and the ice, toxins are coming up and leaching into the soil, the air, and the water. The impact is that people are having high levels of distress from loss of homes, but also from increases in cancer and developmental disorders from all these toxins. It's decreased their lifespan from near 100 to down into the 60s. Another example is the poor and Black in the Mississippi Delta. It's pretty much the same thing. There may not be ice. For them, it's the heat and the increase in vector illnesses. Another one is the 800 people that died in the Northwest heat dome this summer. A disproportionate number of those were immigrant farm laborers, leaving a lot of homeless children, motherless and fatherless children. And I could go on. I have a whole list of examples. The last thing I want to say is, I think as mental health professionals, it's not enough for us to treat mental illnesses. We need to, as Ken Thompson said earlier, we need to join in solidarity with the community in addressing this. Ken gave you his link on his group. I've already looked it up. It's a great thing to get involved in. I would encourage people to also join the Pittsburgh Green New Deal. People need the education. They need to understand. I think the young people on a very gut level do, but a lot of people, older people, need more information to help them understand how and why they should get involved to press to make some fundamental change in our system so that we can keep this from going to 3 and 4 degrees and hopefully keep it at 1.5, probably 1.8 or at least 2. So leave it at that. I have more information if people need to ask questions.
Well, we can leave it at that, but that leaves us with a lot to think about. That was really great, Claire. Thank you. Matt Hurford, we've got you next. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining, and what a just incredibly rich and informative conversation it's been so far. I'm Matt Hurford. I'm a psychiatrist by training, as Bob mentioned, although my work right now really focuses on the funding of the public behavioral health Medicaid system across Pennsylvania. I came to the field of psychiatry primarily through a lens and a motivation around social justice. I sort of think of psychiatry and my medical license most as a trade, and kind of what helped me be able to pay off loans and continue to do work that I love and I care deeply about. And I want to answer the 4 questions, but this theme, as I was reflecting on the ones that Bob shared with us, of alignment and the value of alignment, thinking about how we align our values, how we align our work with the larger work oriented towards the existential threat of climate change, I think is incredibly important for me personally, but also for our ability and our opportunities to educate and empower people from very diverse backgrounds and unique circumstances. So more on that later, but that for me played an important role in my professional journey and my views and beliefs around climate change. The emotions are many as it relates to this issue. I think the ones that for me rise to the surface in terms of prominence, salience and power revolve around the despair, and anger that I feel as a result of what we have done. And we see statistics and framing as we did today in the film, as well as the testimonials and anecdotes and sort of case examples that have been shared. How could it have come to this? How can it continue to go in this direction, given what we know? But I will also admit that I at times feel a sense of, I'll say, transient denial that I know is really in the service of just not wanting it to be as bad as I know it is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in all of us, because it connects to and hopefully can perhaps inform an empathic connection to people who may feel some sense of more durable denial about climate change, or perhaps more commonly, just climate complacency. And that how much of that is really rooted in the sense of powerlessness and denial and feeling like they can't make a difference. And our ability to message and engage people around that and understand that theme, I think, will be enormously important when we think about how do we want to motivate change and bring it to scale. And then finally, there's certainly feelings when whether I indulge in transient denial or think about my role as a person, as an individual in this process of shame. And I think similarly, we have to recognize that coming at this at a policy and a personal level, we have to be exquisitely sensitive to the shame that we run the risk of invoking in people if we appear to be overly judgmental. We simply won't expand our pool of allies in this work. I am grateful to the many mentors and trainers that I have that sort of from a psychodynamic standpoint really opened my mind about the roles of shame in people's decision making. So in terms of skills, I've tried to allude to some of them. I think training as a physician and as a psychiatrist has been very helpful for me. And I would also say that my belief in the kind of overlapping spheres of health, of social factors and determinants and the environment. I think that we've seen some nice graphics this afternoon about the dynamic interplay of those. And the belief that I have that those are inextricably interrelated is both informative, but also empowering, because I believe that by affecting any one, we can help positively and virtuously affect the whole. When it comes to thinking about the most pressing and important issues around climate, the issue of climate complacency to me is number one, because I just don't really believe that we're going to be effective at the kinds of scalable solutions if we don't have broader buy-in. And so I think in particular about the ways in which climate complacency drives and perpetuates the kinds of social disparities, the injustices that we have seen and heard about across racial lines, across ethnic lines, across socioeconomic strata broadly. And the parallels for me in terms of why I wanted to go into mental health are true here in climate as well. The disproportionate impact of climate change on people from marginalized communities, the victims of systemic and systemized racism, and people who don't necessarily and will not have the means at times to help mitigate the impacts of climate change in the near term are abhorrent and should be unacceptable to all of us. I'll say two final points. I want to be respectful of time as well. One is that I think that the recovery movement in mental health and psychiatry is actually a tremendously useful framework for thinking about how we want to support resilience. And I really appreciated Dr. Pollack and others highlighting the importance of resilience, because we think we need that kind of a model and that framework. And so many of the principles of a recovery-oriented approach towards care are applicable to how I think we can engage people, organizations, industries, and nations, which is specifically to try and whenever possible employ strength-based strategies to think about empowering rather than overwhelming and pushing people into a despair, shame area of this. And by doing that, we have to find ways to continue to personalize what climate change means, whether that's about somebody's children, about their shoreline, about their ancestral home, whatever the case may be. That the one-size-fits-all message about and metrics that we use, whether that's by degree changes, about carbon tonnage, et cetera, may be relevant for some people and motivating and useful as a gauge, but for others, we have to be much more hyper-local about what this means in order to understand them. And then finally, I just want to say that getting back to this alignment piece, I think that recognition that so much of the work that we do that is not necessarily labeled or branded as being in support of or related to supporting climate change is in fact enormously valuable in that direction. And I think specifically about the work that our organization does and those that are committed to ensuring that people with serious mental illness and substance use disorders have access to high quality care and supports in their recovery. It really relates to the a kind of hierarchy of needs. We're never going to successfully improve and make meaningful impact on the macro climate unless and until we're successful in supporting the needs of individuals at a microclimate level. We have this, what a tremendous privilege we've had today to be able to spend the day on computers connecting from all over the country to talk about this important issue, to brainstorm and to feed off of each other. Most people don't have that luxury because they don't have the means, because they have to work, because their health is impaired, because they're incarcerated, because on and on. And so we have to recognize that by addressing social injustices, by closing health disparities, by promoting fair and equitable access to housing, food, mental health care, we are helping to bring people to a situation where they can be more likely to be recruited in our global efforts to address climate change. And so I think that the work that we do across the domains that have been mentioned today around addressing inequities and disparities, supporting the social, environmental health of marginalized communities can and should be explicitly called out as an aligned strategy around climate change. Thank you.
Excellent. So rich. We've got a great group here, everybody. What a wonderful discussion we're having. Walter Lewis, good to see you again, Walter. I'm so glad you could be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here as well. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Walter Lewis. I'm the president and CEO of the Homewood Children's Village. Kind of a techie and a scientist who fell into the nonprofit space because I'm an avid advocate for social justice. And you know, I think when I think about the work of the Homewood Children's Village, you know, our mission is to improve the lives of homeless children and simultaneously reweave the fabric of the community in which they live. And so we're focused on the children within our neighborhood and really just trying to improve their lives and transform their community, because we know that's what leads to sustainable change. And we care about young people's development, you know, holistically, which is what brings us into the conversation around climate, environment, and all of these other aspects that impact their health that unfortunately a lot of times in the public school system and a lot of times within even the social service system, we're not talking about these kinds of issues and the impact that they're having on young people and their lives. And so you know, so that's kind of what brought us into this space. And one of the things I'll share quickly before I kind of get into sort of answering the 4 questions is one of the biggest ways that we've tried to engage the space as a, you know, education and social service agency who's not necessarily filled with a lot of climate experts or advocates is really around education and empowerment of folks in the community. And so we have been running a program, a Leadership Institute, where we've really been just providing information to residents. A lot of times we're not even teaching all of the courses ourselves. We work with our local climate groups and environmental justice groups and bring them in for different sessions to really just give people more knowledge and information. Obviously, our communities are very knowledgeable in their lived experience and they have a lot to say, but sometimes they don't understand the jargon. They don't understand what certain terms mean. They haven't gone to school for 4 years to study some of these kinds of things. And so we try to build those connections, not just from a knowledge base, but also people, right? Connecting them to the people. Here's your city councilman, right? Here's, you know, someone who, you know, works in, you know, around these issues downtown, or, you know, here's some leaders from other organizations so that people can put faces to the names and know who they need to talk to when they're trying to push a particular issue. And so that, you know, work is really near and dear to me, you know, as I think about kind of my answers to the 4 questions, and I'll kind of circle back to it. When I think about my emotional response, as I think about climate change, very similar to a number of my colleagues who've spoken before me, it's a mixture, right? And sometimes it's hard to put words to it, right? But it's this mix of, for me, like anger, obviously, like deep sadness though, as well. Just thinking about like, just the state of our planet, right? Like kind of like it didn't have to be this way, and yet it is. And I think it makes me incredibly sad to think about, in spite of all of the things that have happened to us today, the looming threat, right, that is, impending, there are still people that are still like avid deniers. And like that also, again, it just makes me incredibly sad for our planet, and for our children, right, who inherit the decisions that we make. Like I think about what kind of world will my grandchildren, right, and my great grandchildren live in because of the decisions or indecisions of folks in our generation and beyond. I also have incredible hope, though, when I'm in spaces like this, when I talk to young people, and you see so many people that just get it, right? And there isn't this deep need to like try to convince people. And so I also have hope, right, about, I'm hopeful for the future at the same time. When I think about sort of the skills and resources that I bring to the table, similar to Carissa, I'm a connector. Like I feel like I'm really good at connecting all kinds of things, ideas, information, people, opportunities, and really historically have been good at finding the win-win. And it's really helped me develop really strong partnerships over the years in the work that I do. I'm a fundamental believer in like, none of us know everything, right? And so when we're trying to solve these complex challenges, we quickly run into space where we are no longer the expert, right? I know this much, but there's all these things I don't know about. And how do I bring other people to the table and collaborate with them to get to a better outcome? That's something that we've had to do a lot at the Children's Village. And it's something that I think I definitely have been able to bring to the table. And it's really even benefited our climate work as well. Again, we're not the experts oftentimes in this space. We've been able to collaborate with many partners to bring some incredible work to bear in our community. Additionally, obviously running a nonprofit, you get really good at raising money pretty quickly if you want to stay around. So I've gotten better at finding resources to get stuff done, and then also engaging youth. I started this work running our after school programs for high school students. I love young people. That is like my favorite part of the day. If I get to kick it with some kids, particularly teenagers, that's my jam. So I love doing that and designing youth programming and figuring out ways to bring youth into these spaces, right? Like one of the things I always tell my young people, y'all don't have to wait until you finish high school, get your degree, get 4 degrees to join the fight, to join these conversations. You can start doing that now. And what's incredibly powerful, if we listen to our young people, they are so incredibly insightful. I find myself often challenged. I got 4 kids myself, and my 5-year-old son, he often says things to me, and I'm like, where do you come from, man? Like, but it's like their innocent minds, they're problem solving constantly and making sense of information, and they're not as jaded as we are as adults, right? Who sometimes we put up roadblocks in front of our own ideas because we're like, oh, that'll never work. So we don't even say something, but they'll say it. And so I think bringing our young people into these conversations now is critical, not just for helping us solve problems of today, but also so that they are more in tune, so that when they're meeting the challenges of tomorrow, they're already ready. They've been prepared for this, since, they were young. So I think that's really critical. The thing that I would say in terms of what issues are really important to me in climate change, and it goes back to the work that we do at the Village. I mean, for me, it's really about promoting the engagement, resilience, and self-sufficiency within environmental justice communities. I mean, I think for a couple reasons. One is we talk often about how the disproportionate impacts, happen within these communities. So that's one. So we got to be at the table if we're being impacted it's in the worst ways by some of these challenges. Also, I think about resilience and self-sufficiency. The reality is, in spite of all of this great work that everyone's doing, that we will do, because I do believe we're going to make a difference here in this space, our communities are still going to get hit, right? They're being hit now, they're going to continue to get hit. And so we have to be preparing folks within environmental justice communities to think about what are strategies to be able to mitigate some of these impacts, to be prepared and to strategize in ways that they can be self-sufficient in some of these ways as well. We've often seen, unfortunately, where our governments let us down, right? There might be a plan in place, or maybe a very poorly constructed plan in place, and communities suffer because of that lack of planning or that lack of proper planning. And so how do we begin to prepare these communities? And it's not crazy, actually. People already have a lot of ideas and solutions. There's just not usually the investment in those kinds of ideas and solutions. And unfortunately, there's not always access to power for those folks. And so again, I'm really passionate about how do you connect people to power. We've done a lot of training and getting residents on like different boards, advisory boards. What I really want to start to see is a shift in power where more community residents actually hold positions of power. They actually work, downtown, and they're the chief, environmental officer or whatever. I think that will fundamentally begin to shift power because they already know inherently what the issues are within the community, and now they actually are positioned to make some critical changes. Obviously, there's a lot we can do in the meantime, but I think that that's something that I'm really interested in continuing to push for with our work in the community. And so just kind of as my final takeaways, I would just say, again, it's about the people power and how we get people to really feel their power. And in terms of kind of the mental health conversation, one thing that I will add, because there's been so much great said already, is we've done a lot of work historically around sort of the concept of locus of control. And this was really started in our work with young people, right? And so you see a lot of young people who kind of have this huge external locus of control. So, everything it's not up to me. I can't control my destiny. And I think that happens a lot to us when we talk about big things like climate change. It's like, whoa, that's too big. There's nothing I can do. Like, me recycling is not going to change that. And so I think there's a lot of parallels to what we saw in terms of working with young people with locus of control and what we can do in this space. It's not that we want everyone to have this incredibly strong internal sense of locus of control. There is a lot of stuff that's beyond what I can do myself. But we want to help people begin to shift somewhere towards the middle where there's this healthy understanding of what we can control and what we can't, and beginning to get folks to do more focusing around those things that we can control so that we're seizing power in the things that we can seize power around. And so our communities are more engaged in these conversations and we're not just throwing up our hands. And so that's something that, again, I think as we do more people power work, I think people start to feel more empowered and take more of the reins of the power that they already hold and can begin to do the work. So I feel really privileged to be in this conversation. I've learned so much already, from today, and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Beautiful, beautiful. So here's to real power, real authority, really making a difference. It reminded me of the clinicians' wisdom that has it that we don't make people change, we create conditions for change. And that sidesteps some of the difficulty of feeling controlled or being controlled and controlling of others. We're going to talk with Mary Beth for a minute and invite David to make an additional comment, and that'll take us just about to break time, to break time, yes, right. So Mary Beth, would you like to add anything to the discussion?
I'm just in awe of what everyone has said. It's just so wonderful to see so many brilliant people coming together to talk about such important things. One thing that I hang on to that I just wanted to share is the concept of what to do with the difficult feelings, whether it's you, yourself, or the people that you're helping who are the ones with the least power, the first and the worst kinds of situations. And I go back to Viktor Frankl and also to the Buddhist environmentalist Joanna Macy. Viktor Frankl talked about tragic optimism, where even in the worst situations, you have a choice And this is kind of what Walter was talking about with locus of control. You do have a choice about how also to hold on to hope and optimism. And it's not a blind optimism or hope, but it's one that lets you sit side by side with the hard things. And Joanna Macy also talks about that through a Buddhist lens, where you have these horrible, uncomfortable feelings. You don't run from them, you don't stuff them, you don't deny them or be complacent about them. You embrace them, and you also engage with other people outside of yourself to make things better. And that kind of active hope can lead to better solutions. But guys, you all said it. Everyone here has beautifully. I feel like there's a lot of power in Pittsburgh to pull together to address a lot of the problems that we're facing with climate change. So thank you.
Thank you. David.
This has been amazing to listen to these conversations. I so appreciate the wisdom of everyone. I have 2 points to make. One has to do with the thing that you've been talking about in terms of the degree of hope or hopelessness that people feel. I characterize what I go through as being on two parallel continua. One that involves bouncing between hope and hopelessness. And I have been around long enough that I know I'm going to go somewhere else. And if the total sum of the vectors of that bouncing around is that I'm more towards hope, I feel better. But I know that I'll be gravitating in one direction or the other at all times. The other is the gravitating between my ego investment in something happening versus my allowing myself to be detached from it and letting it be. And I can be more comfortable with that and not so worried about the times that I'm getting more ego involved with something, as opposed to making sure there's a good outcome. The second point I want to make is bibliotherapy. There's a good book that just came out. I forgot to mention it, that the GAP Committee on Climate and a young medical student whose brother is a member of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, Jeremy Wurtzel, and his colleague, Lena Chaplin, have done this children's book on climate change. And I just got it for my granddaughter, and it's on Amazon, but you can get it through some other source if you don't like Amazon. And it has good resources at the end for how parents can engage in the climate talk with children. So it's something I would recommend. And then for adults, there is a book that we just reviewed in Psychiatric News. We have a regular column in Psychiatric News and Psychiatric Times on climate and mental health, by the way. And this is a book that's climate science fiction by an amazing writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, called The Ministry for the Future. And I'll just say it's worth it for us to read it, because it's a very stark and discouraging book at the beginning, but it ends up being very hopeful. It starts with a heat wave in India, some 2 or 3 years hence, that kills 20 million people in a couple weeks span. And then what happens? The United Nations creates a ministry for the future to think about future generations. And over the next 30, 40 years, comes together to create a number of solutions: economic solutions, geoengineering solutions, social solutions, dealing with mass migration and so forth. And it's a very compelling book. Kim Stanley, he wrote it in 2020. There was a great interview with him on the New Yorker Radio Hour. I encourage people to read it and see what you think about it. I really thank you for the opportunity to participate in this, and I'll stop at that.
Namaste. Millions of people are uninformed about climate change. If everyone knew about it, our world would see at least 1 in 4 people with mental health issues. I happen to know about it, and so remain awake often at night, or wake up to worry about our future and that of our coming generations. I am Khara Timsina, Executive Director with Bhutanese Community Association of Pittsburgh. I am a former Bhutanese refugee, and I'm speaking for myself And in doing so today, I'm very much worried about climate change because October 2021 was recorded as the warmest October in US records. I represent a community of over 6,000 former refugees from Bhutan and have been in a community leadership position since 2012. I'm a strong believer in climate change, and every day I pay attention to doing my part in the fight to check this change in my own personal level. My most important issue: rising temperature records every year, and the loss of our huge forest resources to wildfires every year in California causes a lot of personal pain to me. I'm worried of losing a lot of species of our flora and fauna forever. If anyone believes in the Lord, then they should understand humans were created to protect other living beings, including the plants, from their extinction. Is it not a shame to forget that special responsibility? I have no special contribution to Climate Reality Project yet, but that is where I feel I belong to. If opportunities to make contributions of my capacity come, these contributions will go to the Climate Reality Project. I'm presenting you the results of a small-scale survey carried out very recently. The respondents of the survey were people under 18, 18 to 30, 30 to 55, and 56 and older. There were 7 questions asked. The respondents were mostly from my own community, but a few of my friends outside the community too participated. I want to appreciate their participation and want to thank them as well. Climate change, its connection to health and our perceptions. My questions asked were: have you heard of climate change? Do you know what climate change is? Do you believe in climate change? Are you worried with the climate change? If yes, about what? How often do you think of climate change? Do you think climate change is causing mental health issues? There were 34 total respondents. 52.9% of respondents were between the ages of 30 and 55. And I had 52.9% participants as female and 47.1% as male. I asked people if how many years they have lived in the United States. 79.4% said they lived in America for more than 5 years. About their education level, 73.5% have attended a college or university. To my question, have you heard of climate change? 94.1% responded with a yes and 5.9% responded no. My second question, do you know what climate change is? 93.9% responded yes and 6.1% responded no. Third question, do you believe in climate change? 93.9% said yes and the remaining said no. My fourth question, are you worried with the climate change? 87.9% said yes and 12.1% said no. My fifth question, if yes in above, about what? And then I had wildfires with 88% and health 84% as the 2 top rated responses. How often do you think of climate change? 51.5% responded sometimes, 45.5% responded often, and 3% said never. To my last question, do you think climate change is causing mental health issues in the world? 72.7% said yes, and 27.3% said no. elsewhere is just here. What happens elsewhere in the world affects us sooner or later. Fires in the Amazon forest will hit us hard without any delay. Submerging of a civilized coastal settlement due to rising sea levels anywhere is a loss to all of us. Victims of a landslide on the Himalayas or elsewhere due to abnormal rain could be you or your dear ones. Believe it or not, but many of the sufferings in the world directly related to adverse conditions brought about by the climate change. Mental health is a severe suffering. To my conclusion, if more people in our country share the same sentiments and reactions we just saw and heard from a lesser educated community like mine, today's America can conform a safer earth to our descendants. Thank you. Namaste.
So let me just mention to everybody that these 4 questions that you've been hearing about are my adaptation of 4 questions that come from this article in 2020 by Emma Morrison, How to Stop Freaking Out and Tackle Climate Change. Among other things, it has the virtue of starting with the issue of shame and guilt and so on that has surfaced here. In that connection, I wanted to mention 2 things. First of all, in a lighthearted way, a supervisor of mine who pointed out to me that the only good that comes from guilt is philanthropies. And second, that this article really just takes us through the dynamics of shame and guilt with the simple principle that every unpleasant feeling has a purpose. And the purpose here is to help us know ourselves, be in the moment. On the other hand, I think an important principle that is worth keeping in mind for ourselves and other people is that when we think about survivor guilt, we're usually, I think, misinterpreting the notion of guilt. You know, I think about guilt as the feeling that I have when I've done something wrong. We're talking about things that we haven't done and wishing that we had done more of. When I worked with veterans, I had a number of people who said they had survivor guilt because, you know, my brother or my battalion leader was killed and so on. And they weren't feeling guilty. They were feeling bad that these people were gone and that they couldn't do more. So there was a sense of regret, but it was clearly driven by the attachment that they had, the bond that they had, a real sense of brotherly, sisterly love. I think a lot of survivor guilt is a misnomer. I would propose that at least for consideration. So Wes is telling me that.
No, your arrow, the chat isn't showing up on the screen.
I see, okay. I wanted to, so I mentioned the article. Oh, thank you. So I just wanted to send this back then and invite Dave Dinich to ask a question and Loren Roth to make a comment. Dave, are you there? Okay.
You need to unmute him.
They should be able to speak now.
I said in the interest of time, Bob, I'll bow to Dr. Roth and let him go first. And if there's a minute, I'll take it.
No, we have a minute. That's okay. Go ahead, Dave.
We do? Okay. Well, thank you. Because so many fascinating things were here. I guess a couple takeaway points is that a number of the speakers today, everyone talked about interconnectivity. I think it was Mary Beth who said everything is coming together, everything is connected. And then just now with Claire talking about the biggest challenge is how are we going to educate and motivate people from all walks of life that this is a group of a lot of smart, committed, and dedicated people. And Matt, I translated one of the things he said is, how do we have psychiatrists for coal miners? Ken's the one talked about the MacArthur plan. And we're talking about the combination of what's happening to the planet and then what the planet is doing to people. Who was it? David, I think, said 5-6 years ago, other psychiatrists were saying, yeah, that's sort of important, but that's so far away. That's not affecting us right now. And it was just several months ago in Philadelphia where you saw the great floods that were washing some of the main streets. You couldn't travel there for a while. So my point here, as things are interconnected, and you're talking about this as a problem to look at one way, a problem to look at another way. I would like to phrase it too and say it's both a marketing and a political problem because we have very influential people in this country who are not only denying climate change, but saying it's not only doesn't it be there, we need to put more money and give tax credits to fossil fuel people. That's taking place right now. Has been in Pennsylvania, for years. So I think one of our strategies or something to think about is how do we do, as Claire said, change, bring in a lot of other people of all stripes to seeing that this is important. And I'm just wondering if there would be a concentration, not for the clinical aspect, a concentration or how this is affecting neighbors, people in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, and in surrounding areas. And
Dave, excuse me.
yes,
I'm going to take executive privilege here. And
I'm done.
I can interrupt you here. I think this has got a tag. I was saying that we're getting into the wrap-up discussion here, and therefore keep this in mind if you want to add something more to it later. Loren Roth was going to be with us for the opener, couldn't quite work that out, but is here now. Loren, would you want to have a last word? Just take 2 or 3 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, Bob, Wes, and all that have done this is just a fantastic day, and an enormous credit needs to be, in my view, given. The second point, to me, the main point, is that human beings have been evolving, and I read about that, and that's somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 to get us to today. So in 250 years, or at least our consciousness, maybe 50 years, look what we've got. And from a temporal dimension, we are living within the nuclear explosion that David alluded to so appropriately. Now, I have a background in preparedness, and although I would like to be optimistic, it is difficult. So I did preparedness for 7 years at UPMC directing it. When there's an emergency, and you see it all the time, people work together. Bring in the helpers after each disaster. But when the emergency goes away, then the preparedness goes downhill. So what I think to capture the day is we need to do the same as nuclear power has done. Where is the biological clock that starts 200 to 500,000 years ago and results in our being, what, 30 seconds away from something that the scientists say is irreparable in the sense of self-defeating, because you get to a certain temperature point and then worse makes worse. So I could go on, but there needs to be an intensive thought about the emergency. Because I think, as Mark Dixon said earlier in the day, there's a great big gap. And we have to make up that gap through being clever, because we're human beings and should be grateful. I am done.
Thank you, Loren. Thank you.